I'll defend my dad in court. Daniel Whitmore looked up from the papers on his desk and blinked. Then he leaned back in his chair and laughed softly. Annie, he said, shaking his head. Who told you to say that? No one, she replied. Daniel studied her, amused despite the heavy tension that had filled the Whitmore townhouse for weeks. You're sure? He asked. Because that sounds like something a lawyer would say. I just thought of it. Daniel chuckled again and rubbed his eyes. Well, he said gently, I appreciate the loyalty. But you're a little too small to defend anyone in court. I'm not small. You're 6. That's not small. Daniel smiled despite himself. On Daniel's desk sat a stack of legal files, affidavits, witness statements, evidence submissions. Tomorrow morning he would walk into Manhattan Family Court and face accusations that had already begun spreading through business news and gossip columns. His wife, Laura Whitmore, had accused him of infidelity. The accusation had come only days after Daniel filed for divorce. And somehow, within hours, photographs had appeared, witnesses had appeared, stories had appeared. Daniel suspected manipulation, but suspicion wasn't proof. Annie climbed into the leather chair across from his desk, her feet swinging slightly above the floor. Daniel folded his hands together. All right, he said playfully. Let's hear it. Annie tilted her head. Hear what? If you're defending me in court, Daniel said, smiling. You must have a plan. Annie nodded immediately. I do. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? Yes. How exactly are you planning to defend me? Annie reached into her pocket and pulled out an old phone. She pulled out a small phone. Daniel frowned slightly. That's the old phone I gave you for games. Yes. And that's your courtroom strategy? Annie nodded again. I have evidence. Daniel leaned back slowly. Evidence? She held up the phone. A recording. Daniel's smile faded. A recording of what? Annie pressed a button. I'll show you. Before Daniel could respond, the tiny speaker crackled. Then 2 voices filled the quiet office. The first voice was Laura's, unmistakable. If the judge believes Daniel cheated, Laura said on the recording, the divorce settlement will crush him. Daniel froze. The second voice followed immediately. Ryan Whitmore, Daniel's younger brother. Relax, Ryan said. The fake girlfriend story is airtight. Annie watched him quietly. The recording continued. Laura laughed softly. I still can't believe that actress agreed to testify. She was expensive, Ryan replied. But worth it. Daniel's fingers slowly tightened against the edge of his desk. On the recording, Ryan continued. Once the court believes Daniel had an affair, his reputation collapses. Investors panic. The board turns against him. Laura's voice returned. And I get half the company. Ryan chuckled. And I finally get control of the rest. The room fell silent as the recording ended. The phone speaker clicked off. For several seconds, Daniel didn't move. He sat completely still in the leather chair, staring at nothing. Then he whispered, "Play it again." Annie pressed the button. Laura and Ryan's voices rang out again, calmly discussing the destruction of Daniel Whitmore's life. When the recording ended again, Daniel leaned back slowly, running a hand across his mouth. He felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. Laura's betrayal had already shattered his marriage. But hearing his own brother calmly plotting his downfall, that was something else entirely. Annie slipped her hand into her pocket again. I have more. Daniel looked up. She placed 3 photographs on the desk. They were slightly crooked, clearly taken by small hands trying not to be noticed. In the first photo, Laura and Ryan stood close together in the kitchen late at night. In the second, Ryan's hand rested on Laura's waist. In the third, they were laughing together beside the kitchen island. Daniel stared at the images. Then he leaned back again, exhaling slowly. For years he had trusted Ryan, defended him, helped him when his business ventures failed, brought him into family holidays. And all that time Ryan had been waiting for the right moment to take everything. Daniel looked back at Annie. How did you get these? I used your tablet. And the recording? I was in the hallway, Annie said. They didn't know. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. The city outside continued its endless movement. But inside the office, everything felt very still. Finally, he opened his eyes again. Annie, yes? You understand this is very serious, right? She nodded. That's why I said I'd defend you. Daniel let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. You're 6 years old. But I have the truth. Daniel looked at her again. There was no fear in her eyes, just certainty. Across the room, the office door opened quietly. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks stepped inside, carrying a tray. "Dinner is—" She stopped when she saw Daniel's face. "What happened?" Daniel gestured toward the phone. "My 6-year-old just handed me the key to my entire divorce case." Eleanor raised her eyebrows. "Well," she said calmly, "I always did say that child was observant." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Observant is one thing." He looked back at Annie. "But defending me in court?" Annie zipped her backpack closed and stood up. "I can do it." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, sweetheart." "Why not?" "Because tomorrow that courtroom will be full of lawyers who studied the law for years." Annie looked up at him. "But they don't know the truth." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He stood up and walked around the desk. Then he knelt beside her. "Listen to me," he said softly. "I'm grateful you want to help." Annie nodded. "But no matter what happens tomorrow," he brushed a curl from her forehead, "you remember something." "What?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Family isn't something you inherit." He tapped the purple backpack resting against her leg. "It's something you choose to protect." Annie looked at the phone once again. Inside that phone was the truth. And tomorrow morning, in a courtroom full of powerful adults, that truth was going to explode. That night, long after Annie went upstairs, Daniel Whitmore remained alone in his office. The townhouse had grown quiet. Daniel sat behind his desk, staring at nothing. But his mind was not empty. It kept returning to one small detail: the phone in Annie's pocket. When she had stood in front of him earlier, the phone had been tucked into the front pocket of her jeans, barely noticeable. Just an old device he had once given her to play games when she was bored. And yet inside that phone was a recording that could destroy 2 people. Laura. Ryan. Daniel leaned back slowly and closed his eyes. The voices came back instantly. "If the judge believes Daniel cheated, the divorce settlement will crush him." Laura's voice. Ryan's reply followed in Daniel's memory just as clearly as if the recording were playing again. "Relax. The fake girlfriend story is airtight." Daniel's jaw tightened. Fake girlfriend. Expensive actress. Courtroom testimony. A lie carefully designed to look like truth. He opened his eyes and stared at the photographs lying on the desk. Annie had taken them with his tablet. The images were slightly crooked, the angle uneven. A child's hands had clearly held the camera, but the meaning was unmistakable. Laura standing close to Ryan in the kitchen. Ryan's hand on her waist, both of them laughing like they were sharing a private victory. Daniel picked up one of the photos and studied it again. The timestamp glowed faintly in the corner. 2 nights ago, while he had been upstairs finishing a conference call with investors, while Annie had been down the hallway listening, Daniel set the photo down again. For years, he had believed betrayal would feel dramatic if it ever arrived. Explosive, violent, but the reality was quieter. It was the slow realization that people you trusted had been standing beside you while secretly measuring the distance to your fall. Daniel pushed back from the desk and walked toward the window. Manhattan stretched beneath him, glowing with thousands of lights. 5 years ago, he had bought this townhouse after Whitmore Dynamics went public. At the time, Laura had insisted the house needed a kitchen renovation, new furniture, imported marble floors. Daniel had agreed without argument. Now the house felt different, not like a home, more like a stage where someone had been rehearsing a lie. He exhaled slowly. Laura's anger when he asked for a divorce had been immediate, but what had shocked him was how fast the accusations followed. Within days, she had filed court documents claiming Daniel had been unfaithful. Within days, photographs had appeared. Within days, a witness, a woman Daniel had never seen before, had come forward claiming she had been in a relationship with him. At the time, Daniel had assumed desperation. Now he understood. Planning. He could hear Ryan's voice again. The fake girlfriend story is airtight. Daniel closed his eyes again. His younger brother. Ryan had always been charming, always good with people, always just irresponsible enough that Daniel ended up helping him more times than he could count. When Ryan's startup failed 3 years ago, Daniel had quietly paid off the debt. When Ryan asked to move back to New York, Daniel had offered him a guest room. Family, Daniel had believed, deserved patience. Now the word felt bitter. Behind him, the office door opened softly. Eleanor Brooks stepped inside. She carried 2 mugs of tea. "You're still awake," she said. Daniel turned slightly. "I doubt sleep is coming tonight." Eleanor placed 1 mug on the desk beside the photographs. Her eyes moved over the images without surprise. "Those the ones Annie took?" Daniel nodded. "She also recorded them." Eleanor folded her arms. "That child notices everything." Daniel picked up the mug but didn't drink. She overheard Laura and Ryan talking. Eleanor hid. Well, she said quietly, sometimes the truth doesn't arrive from where we expect it. Daniel looked toward the staircase. Do you think she understood what she heard? Eleanor considered the question. Children don't always understand the details, she said. But they understand when something is wrong. Daniel nodded slowly. In his mind, he saw Annie standing in the doorway earlier that evening. Small, serious, the phone hidden in her pocket. I'll defend my dad in court. If this moment touched your heart and reminded you how powerful loyalty and truth can be, please take a moment to like this video. Share in the comments where you are watching from because I would love to see how far this story has reached. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Daniel shook his head slightly. She actually thinks she can help. Eleanor smiled faintly. Maybe she already has. Daniel glanced at the desk again. The photographs, the recording, evidence he hadn't even known existed, and all of it discovered by a 6-year-old who had simply been walking down the hallway at the right moment. Eleanor lifted her mug. You should try to get some rest. Daniel stared out the window again. I keep hearing their voices. Eleanor didn't ask which ones. She knew. If the judge believes Daniel cheated, the fake girlfriend story is airtight. Daniel turned back to the desk. Tomorrow the courtroom will be full of lawyers, he said quietly. But the truth has been sitting in my daughter's pocket this whole time. Eleanor nodded. Funny how that works. Daniel sat down again and carefully gathered the photographs. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. His lawyer answered after 2 rings. Charles Bennett. Charles, Daniel said calmly, we need to talk. You sound serious. I have evidence. A pause. What kind of evidence? Daniel looked down at the small phone Annie had left on the desk earlier before going upstairs. Inside that phone was the recording. Inside that recording was Laura and Ryan calmly discussing the destruction of his life. Daniel spoke quietly. The kind that might change everything. Upstairs, Annie lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her hands rested on the blanket, but the phone was still in the pocket of her jeans, hanging over the chair beside the bed. Inside it, the recording waited silently. Annie closed her eyes. Tomorrow there would be a courtroom. Tomorrow adults would argue about things she didn't fully understand. But Annie understood one thing very clearly. Someone had lied about her dad, and she was going to help fix it. Morning came slowly over Manhattan. Gray winter light filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore townhouse, turning the polished wooden floors pale and quiet. The city outside had already begun its daily rhythm, delivery trucks rumbling down Park Avenue. Distant taxi horns. The low murmur of early commuters heading toward Midtown. But inside the Whitmore house, the morning carried a different kind of tension. Daniel Whitmore had barely slept. He had fallen into bed sometime after 3 in the morning. But his mind had refused to shut down. Every time he closed his eyes, the same voices returned. Laura, Ryan. The words echoed like a recording that refused to stop. If the judge believes Daniel cheated, the divorce settlement will crush him. Daniel sat at the kitchen table now, a mug of coffee cooling in front of him. His suit jacket hung neatly over the back of the chair, and the morning newspaper lay folded beside his phone. The headline caught his attention immediately. Tech billionaire's marriage scandal heads to court. Daniel exhaled slowly and pushed the paper aside. Across the kitchen, Eleanor Brooks moved quietly between the stove and the counter, preparing breakfast with the same calm rhythm she had used for decades. Eggs, toast, coffee. Routine had always been her answer to chaos. You should eat something, Eleanor said without turning around. Daniel gave a faint smile. That obvious? You've been staring at that coffee for 10 minutes. Daniel took a sip. It had gone cold. Charles is meeting me at the courthouse at 9, he said. Eleanor nodded. You told him about the recording? Yes. And? He wants to hear it himself before we decide how to present it. Eleanor placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. Smart man. Daniel nodded absently. His thoughts drifted upstairs. To Annie. For the first time since she had arrived in his life 5 years earlier, she would be walking into a courtroom. The idea unsettled him more than the accusations. Children weren't meant to see the machinery of adult conflict. They weren't meant to watch trust collapse under legal arguments and sworn testimony. Footsteps echoed from the staircase. Daniel looked up. Annie appeared in the doorway, her hair slightly messy from sleep. She wore jeans and a small gray sweater, and her sneakers were only half tied. Morning, she said. Daniel's face softened instantly. Morning, kiddo. She climbed into the chair beside him. Eleanor placed a plate in front of her. Eat, Eleanor said gently. Annie picked up a piece of toast and dipped it into her eggs. For a moment, the three of them sat in silence. Then Annie looked at Daniel. Is today the court day? Daniel nodded. Yes. She chewed thoughtfully. Are the people who lied about you going to be there? Yes. Annie nodded slowly, as if confirming something in her mind. Daniel watched her carefully. You don't have to come with me, he said. Mrs. Brooks can take you to school instead. Annie shook her head immediately. I want to go. Daniel Seahilled. Courtrooms are boring. That's okay. Lots of talking. That's okay too. Daniel leaned closer. Sometimes adults say things that don't make sense. Annie swallowed the last bite of toast. I know. Daniel studied her face. She looked calm. Too calm. Annie, he said gently. About what you said yesterday. I meant it. Daniel smiled faintly. I know you did. Annie slid her hand into the pocket of her jeans. The small phone was still there. Daniel noticed. His stomach tightened again. That phone had haunted his thoughts all night. Inside it was the truth. And the truth, once revealed, had a way of changing everything. Annie looked at him. Did the lawyer hear the recording? Not yet. Will he? Yes. She nodded, satisfied. Eleanor poured more coffee into Daniel's mug. You should leave soon, she said. Traffic will be awful. Daniel checked the clock. Badin Shurfin. He stood and picked up his jacket. Annie slid off her chair immediately. I'm ready. Daniel smiled. You finished breakfast in record time. Annie shrugged. I didn't want to be late. 20 minutes later, they stepped outside into the cold Manhattan morning. The black sedan waited at the curb. Daniel opened the passenger door for Annie. She climbed in. As the car pulled into traffic, Daniel stared out the window at the city rushing past. Skyscrapers, coffee shops, people walking quickly with their heads down. Normal life. Yet somewhere in downtown Manhattan, a courtroom was waiting. A courtroom where his reputation would be dismantled piece by piece if Laura's story held. Daniel felt Annie's small hand slip into his. He looked down. She was staring straight ahead through the windshield. Serious. Focused. Dad? She said. Yes. Don't worry. Daniel smiled faintly. I'll try. Annie squeezed his hand. I told you already. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Told me what? That I'll defend you. Daniel chuckled softly. You're very determined. Yes. The courthouse appeared ahead as the car turned onto Center Street. A tall stone building rising above the busy sidewalks. Daniel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him again. The weight of public scrutiny. The weight of lawyers and testimony. The weight of reputation. But beside him sat a 6-year-old girl who believed none of that mattered as much as the truth. The car stopped. Daniel stepped out first and walked around to Annie's side. He helped her onto the sidewalk. Reporters already gathered near the entrance. Cameras, microphones, curious faces. The whispers began immediately. That's him. Whitmore. Where's his wife? Daniel ignored them. He took Annie's hand and guided her toward the courthouse doors. Inside, the air smelled of marble and old paper. Lawyers hurried down hallways carrying files. Voices echoed through the high ceilings. At the end of the corridor stood a tall man in a navy suit. Charles Bennett, Daniel's attorney. Charles turned as they approached. Daniel, he said, extending his hand. They shook. Charles glanced down at Annie. And this must be Annie. She nodded politely. Hello. Charles smiled warmly. Nice to meet you. Then his expression shifted slightly. Daniel, he said quietly. Do you have the recording? Daniel looked down at Annie. She reached into her pocket. Slowly, carefully. Then she pulled out the phone. Charles stared at it. That's it. Daniel nodded. That's the one. Charles took the phone and looked at the screen. Well, he said softly, let's hear it. And in that moment, none of them yet realized that within the next hour, a 6-year-old girl was about to change the direction of an entire courtroom. Charles Bennett held the phone in one hand and stared at it as though it were a live wire. They were standing in a narrow consultation room just off the main corridor of Manhattan Family Court, a space with beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a long wooden table that had probably heard too many bad marriages explained badly. Outside, footsteps echoed across the marble floors. Doors opened and shut. Lawyers passed by speaking in low, urgent voices, but inside the room, everything narrowed to the old phone in Charles's hand. He looked at Daniel first. You're telling me this came from Annie? Daniel nodded. Charles turned toward the child standing beside the table. Annie had both hands clasped in front of her now. Her face was calm, though her eyes were watchful. She looked smaller in the harsh courthouse light than she had at home. Charles's voice softened. "Annie, did you record this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know when you made it?" "2 nights ago." Charles gave a short glance to Daniel, then tapped the screen. The recording began. Laura's voice came through first, thin and metallic through the small speaker, but unmistakable. "If the judge believes Daniel cheated, the divorce settlement will crush him." Charles's expression changed immediately. Ryan's voice followed, smug and relaxed. "Relax. The fake girlfriend story is airtight." No one in the room moved. Daniel watched Charles carefully. He had spent most of the night imagining this moment, wondering whether hearing the recording in a courthouse would make it feel more real or less. It did neither. It simply made the betrayal sound official. The recording played on. Laura laughed. "I still can't believe that actress agreed to testify." "She was expensive," Ryan said, "but worth it." When the recording ended, the room went silent. Charles lowered the phone slowly. "Well," he said at last, "that changes things." Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. Charles looked back at Annie. "And those pictures your father mentioned?" Annie looked at Daniel for permission. He nodded. She reached into her coat pocket this time and pulled out the 3 photographs, slightly bent at the corners. Charles laid them out on the table one by one. Laura and Ryan in the kitchen. Laura and Ryan standing too close. Ryan's hand around her waist. Charles studied each picture with the quick precision of a man trained to separate emotion from usefulness. Then he looked up. "Daniel, did anyone else have access to this house that night?" "No." "Security cameras?" Daniel frowned. "Exterior only." Laura insisted she didn't want indoor cameras. Charles muttered, "Of course she did." He tapped the photographs with one finger. "These help. The recording is the bigger weapon." Daniel folded his arms. "Can we use it?" Charles hesitated. "There are 2 questions. First, can we authenticate it? Second, how does the judge react to a recording made by a 6-year-old in the middle of a domestic dispute?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's real. I know it's real," Charles said. "The law and the truth are related, Daniel, but they are not twins." Annie listened carefully, her eyes moving from one man to the other. Then she asked, "Does that mean the truth might not help?" Both men looked at her. Charles gave a tired half-smile. "It means we need to be smart about how we use it." Before Annie could answer, someone knocked on the door. A clerk stepped in. "Mr. Bennett?" "They're ready in courtroom 4. Charles nodded. "We'll be there in a minute." The clerk disappeared again. Charles turned to Daniel. "Here's what we do. Laura's attorney is going to open with the affair narrative. They'll present the witness, the pictures, and probably try to establish a pattern of deception. I'll push back, but I don't want to reveal this too early, unless I have to." Daniel frowned. "You're waiting?" "I'm choosing timing," Charles said. "There's a difference." He glanced down at Annie. "For now, she stays with the court attendant in the waiting room. I do not want her in that courtroom unless it becomes absolutely necessary." Annie straightened at once. "I should stay with Dad." Daniel knelt in front of her before Charles could answer. "Listen to me," he said gently. "You've already helped more than you know, but what if they lie again?" Daniel held her shoulders lightly. "They probably will." Annie's face tightened. "Then I should be there." Daniel felt something twist in his chest. There it was again, that impossible mixture of childhood and courage, innocence and iron. "Maybe later," he said softly, "but not at the beginning." She didn't like that answer. He could see it. Still, after a moment, she nodded once. Charles checked his watch. "We have to move." They stepped back into the corridor together. The courthouse was more crowded now. Reporters clustered near the elevators, hoping for a glimpse of scandal. 2 older women sitting on a bench whispered to each other as Daniel passed. A man in a dark coat openly stared. Public disgrace had a way of turning strangers into spectators. At the far end of the hall stood Laura Whitmore. She wore cream-colored wool, understated and expensive. Her blonde hair was swept neatly back, her makeup carefully restrained for court. Beside her stood Ryan, lean and composed in a charcoal suit, looking every inch the grieving brother forced into an ugly family matter. Daniel stopped walking. For a moment, the hallway seemed to narrow. Laura met his gaze first. There was no shame in her face. Only calculation. Ryan slipped one hand into his pocket and gave Daniel the faintest smile, the kind men use when they believe the outcome is already decided. Daniel looked from one to the other and thought, not anymore. Laura's attorney, Valerie Haynes, stepped toward them with a folder in hand. "Mr. Whitmore," she said coolly. "Ms. Haynes." Her eyes dropped briefly to Annie, then back to Daniel. "I trust there won't be any theatrics today," Charles answered before Daniel could. "Not from our side." Valerie gave him a thin smile and walked on. Laura bent toward Annie as Daniel moved past. "You look very pretty this morning," she said, as if they were meeting at a school recital instead of a courthouse. Annie said nothing. Ryan's gaze flicked toward the child and then away, dismissive, careless. Daniel leaned slightly toward Laura. "That was a mistake," he said quietly. Laura's smile did not move. "I have no idea what you mean." Ryan let out a soft breath through his nose, almost a laugh. Charles touched Daniel's arm. "Not here." Daniel stepped back. A court officer appeared and motioned them toward the courtroom doors. Eleanor, who had arrived a few minutes behind them, came forward just then and took Annie's hand. "I'll stay right here with her," she told Daniel. He nodded gratefully, though it cost him something to let go of Annie's shoulder. She looked up at him. "Dad?" "Yes. If they say bad things, don't believe them." For a second, the noise of the corridor faded. Daniel managed to smile. "I won't." Then the courtroom doors opened. Inside, the room was already filling. Dark wood, high ceilings. The state seal behind the bench. Rows of polished pews where reporters and curious spectators leaned forward with sharpened attention. At the front, 2 tables waited beneath the judge's empty chair like opposing altars. Daniel walked beside Charles toward the defense table and took his seat. Across the aisle, Laura and Ryan sat with Valerie Haynes, arranging papers with the calm confidence of people who believed they were about to tell the winning story. Charles set down his briefcase and leaned toward Daniel. "Let them start," he murmured. "Let them get comfortable." Daniel kept his eyes on the far table. The recording was still in Charles's inside pocket. Laura didn't know that. Ryan didn't know that. And somewhere outside that room, a 6-year-old girl waited with the simple certainty that truth ought to matter. A side door opened. The bailiff called the room to order, and as Judge Miriam Holloway stepped onto the bench, Daniel Whitmore understood that the real battle was beginning now. Judge Miriam Holloway settled into her chair and adjusted her glasses with the composed efficiency of a woman who had spent 20 years watching people lie under oath. The bailiff called for silence. The room obeyed. Daniel Whitmore sat very still at the defense table, hands folded, expression controlled. He had learned long ago that composure was a form of armor. In boardrooms, it reassured investors. In negotiations, it unsettled opponents. In a courtroom, he hoped it would at least keep him from looking like a man whose wife and younger brother had tried to destroy him. Across the aisle, Laura Whitmore sat with her spine straight and her face arranged into a portrait of subdued injury. She wore grief the way she wore expensive clothes, tailored, flattering, designed to be noticed without seeming to ask for attention. Ryan sat beside her, looking grave in the practiced way of men who believed solemnity could pass for sincerity. Judge Holloway opened the file in front of her. "We are here in the matter of Whitmore versus Whitmore," she said. "Counsel, I expect efficiency, professionalism, and relevance. This court is not interested in spectacle. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," both attorneys answered. Valerie Haynes rose first. She moved to the center of the courtroom with a file in one hand and a confidence that suggested she had rehearsed every syllable of what she was about to say. "Your Honor," she began, "this is a case about betrayal. My client, Laura Whitmore, entered her marriage in good faith, supported her husband through the rise of his company, helped build a household and a family, and only recently discovered that Mr. Whitmore had been engaged in a sustained extramarital affair." She paused, letting the words settle over the room. In the gallery, a reporter lowered his pen just enough to look more closely at Daniel. Valerie continued, "This betrayal did not merely destroy a marriage. It humiliated my client publicly, destabilized her family privately, and revealed a pattern of deception that will be relevant to this court's consideration of the financial and custodial issues before it." Daniel kept his eyes forward. Deception. The word hit him with a peculiar kind of insult now, coming from the wrong mouth. Valerie turned and gestured lightly toward Laura. "Mrs. Whitmore did not want this fight. But when a wife is confronted with infidelity, concealment, and dishonor, she has no choice but to seek justice. Charles Bennett, seated beside Daniel, wrote something on his yellow legal pad and slid it across the table. Let her overplay it. Daniel gave the slightest nod. Valerie called her first witness. The woman who stepped forward looked exactly the way Daniel had imagined after hearing the recording the night before. Attractive, polished, and just nervous enough to seem believable. Mid-30s, dark hair, understated navy dress, the face of someone carefully styled to look like she had not been carefully styled. She introduced herself as Natalie Mercer. Daniel had never seen her in his life. She was sworn in and took her seat. Valerie approached with a sympathetic expression. Miss Mercer. How do you know Mr. Whitmore? Natalie lowered her eyes before answering. We met at a charity dinner last spring. And after that, we started seeing each other. The words moved through the courtroom like a draft of cold air. Valerie softened her voice. For how long? Almost 8 months. Daniel felt, rather than saw, the subtle shift in attention around the room. People were leaning in now. Not because the story was true, but because stories of betrayal always carried a kind of appetite. Valerie asked for details. Restaurants, hotels, texts never sent into evidence but described with emotional specificity. A weekend in Connecticut that had never happened. Natalie delivered every line with the perfect balance of embarrassment and conviction. It was almost impressive. Daniel glanced toward the bench. Judge Holloway's expression had not changed. That gave him a flicker of hope. Valerie then introduced photographs. The same photographs Laura had already leaked to the press. Grainy images of Daniel seated at a restaurant table across from Natalie, one outside a hotel entrance. One blurry shot of them walking down a sidewalk. Daniel had spent the previous week trying to remember the woman. The recording had answered that question for him. He hadn't forgotten her. He had never met her. Valerie held up one photograph for the court. Would you identify the individuals in this image? Natalie folded her hands. That's me, she said softly. And Daniel. Valerie looked toward the judge. No further questions at this time. Charles rose slowly. He took his time walking to the witness stand, not with theatrical arrogance, but with the quiet patience of a man who knew time itself could be a tool. Miss Mercer, he began pleasantly. You say you met my client at a charity dinner last spring. Yes. Which one? Natalie blinked. The Children's Cancer Foundation Gala. Charles nodded as if encouraging her. At the plaza? Yes. Charles smiled faintly. That's unfortunate. Natalie shifted in her seat. Why? Charles turned toward the judge. Because, Your Honor, my client was not in New York on the date of that event. He was in San Francisco speaking at the Global AI Ethics Summit. We have documentation, video, and hotel records establishing that fact. For the first time, Natalie's composure slipped, just a little. Valerie rose at once. Your Honor, counsel is testifying. Charles didn't look at her. I'm setting up impeachment. Judge Holloway nodded once. Proceed. Charles turned back to Natalie. Would you like to revise your answer? Natalie swallowed. I may have the event wrong. Of course, Charles said gently. Let's try another question. You testified you were involved with Mr. Whitmore for 8 months. During that time, did he ever visit your home? Yes. Where do you live? Natalie hesitated. Westchester. Charles opened a folder. Interesting. Because the investigator report your counsel disclosed lists your primary residence as an apartment on West 58th Street. Which address was he visiting? Natalie's mouth parted. But no answer came immediately. In the second row of the gallery, someone shifted hard enough for the bench to creak. Valerie objected again, but it sounded thinner this time. Charles continued, his tone still maddeningly polite. Miss Mercer, did anyone help you prepare your testimony today? My lawyer. No. Let me rephrase. Did anyone pay you to tell this story? Natalie looked instantly at Valerie. That was all Charles needed. No further questions, he said. He returned to the table while a murmur rolled through the gallery. Judge Holloway rapped once for order. Daniel kept his face expressionless. But inside, something had changed. It was small, but real. For the first time that morning, the narrative Laura had built showed its first visible crack. Valerie recovered quickly enough to redirect, smoothing over Natalie's inconsistencies with vague references to stress, memory, and trauma. But the rhythm was broken now. The witness no longer sounded wounded. She sounded rehearsed. When Natalie stepped down, Laura took the stand. Daniel had expected this part to be harder. He was right. Laura looked at the judge with glassy eyes and measured restraint. She spoke of disappointment, of sleepless nights, of noticing Daniel growing distant, of phone calls taken in private and dinners missed and emotional abandonment that, in her telling, was every bit as cruel as physical betrayal. It was a better performance than Natalie's, because some of it was built on truth. Daniel had grown distant, not because of an affair, but because the marriage had been dying in increments too small to name at first. Laura had become colder over the years, more absent even while present, more interested in appearances than intimacy. But emotional distance, once described skillfully, could be made to sound like guilt. Valerie guided her carefully. "And when did you decide to file?" Laura lowered her gaze. "When I realized he was going to leave me and make it look like my fault." That lie landed harder than the others. Daniel felt it in his chest. Charles put one hand flat on the table, a small signal to stay still. "Stay patient. Wait," Laura continued, now speaking of Annie in tones of maternal concern. "I worried what all this instability was doing to her. She's such a sensitive child." Daniel nearly laughed at the audacity of it. Laura had not attended a single parent-teacher conference in 2 years. She forgot Annie's pediatrician's name twice last month. She treated the child with occasional polished affection, as if motherhood were another social role that mattered most in photographs. Still, she said it beautifully. That was the danger. A lie told clumsily collapses. A lie told elegantly can stand for years. By the time Laura stepped down for recess, the courtroom was heavy with conflicting impressions. Valerie had built her story. Charles had weakened part of it. But the central accusation still hung in the air. As people began to rise, Judge Holloway announced a 15-minute break. Daniel stayed seated. His shoulders were tight, his jaw sore from holding still. Charles turned toward him. "She's good," Daniel said quietly. "She's practiced," Charles replied. Daniel looked toward the back of the courtroom doors. Somewhere outside, Annie was waiting with Eleanor. The truth was still not in this room. Not yet. Charles followed his gaze. "We may need the recording in the next session," he said. Daniel nodded once. At the far table, Laura leaned toward Ryan. Ryan murmured something in her ear, and the corner of her mouth lifted in the faintest suggestion of a smile. They still thought they were ahead, and for one more brief moment, they were. When the courtroom emptied for recess, Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the polished wood of the table in front of him. He could still hear Laura's voice in his head. "I realized he was going to leave me and make it look like my fault." It was the kind of sentence that sounded true because it borrowed the shape of pain. That was what made Laura dangerous. She did not simply lie. She arranged lies so they resembled the emotional outline of reality. Enough truth at the edges, enough injury in the tone, enough restraint in the delivery. Across the aisle, Laura rose gracefully from her chair. Ryan stood beside her, leaning in to murmur something that made her mouth twitch into the faintest smile. Not triumph exactly, something more private. The satisfaction of people who believed they had bent the room in their direction. Charles Bennett gathered a few files and placed them neatly into 2 stacks. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's step outside." Daniel stood and followed him through the side door into the corridor. The hallway was crowded with motion and whispers. Reporters hovered near the stairwell, pretending not to stare. Clerks moved briskly with folders in hand. 2 older men in suits stood by a water fountain discussing some other case in low voices, their conversation halting as Daniel passed. At the far end of the hall, Eleanor Brooks sat on a wooden bench with Annie beside her. The child looked up as soon as she saw Daniel. He felt his chest loosen at once. There was something almost absurd about it. The way a courtroom full of adults could make him feel more uncertain than the quiet sight of a 6-year-old waiting with her hands folded in her lap. Annie slid off the bench when he approached. "How bad was it?" she asked. Daniel managed a small smile. "Straight to business?" She nodded. Charles answered before Daniel could. "They told their story. We pushed back." Annie looked at him carefully. "Did they lie?" Charles gave a soft huff of laughter. "Yes." "Then why are they still allowed to talk?" That question landed harder than the adults around her would have guessed. Daniel knelt so he could look her in the eye. "Because in court," he said gently, "the truth sometimes takes time." Annie frowned. That doesn't seem fair. No, Daniel said. It doesn't. Eleanor watched the exchange with quiet concern. She had dressed carefully that morning in a navy coat and pearl earrings, as if respectability itself might offer protection. Her posture remained composed, but Daniel knew her well enough to see the tension in the way she folded her hands. Charles glanced down the corridor to make sure no one was close enough to hear. We need to talk about next steps. Daniel stood. Here? Charles looked at Annie, then at Eleanor. Not in front of the entire courthouse. Eleanor rose immediately. I'll take Annie to the waiting room. Annie looked displeased. I want to stay. Daniel hesitated. He hated the idea of shutting her out, especially now, when she had already carried more truth than anyone else in the building. But he also knew she was still a child, no matter how steady her voice or clear her thinking. Just for a few minutes, he said. Annie's eyes narrowed slightly in thought. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the old phone. She held it toward Daniel. In case you need it. Daniel took the phone, and the weight of it felt strangely disproportionate in his hand. Light, scratched, outdated, and somehow carrying more consequence than every polished exhibit Laura's side had submitted that morning. He closed his fingers around it. Thank you. Annie studied his face for one more second, as if checking whether he truly understood what he held. Then she turned and let Eleanor guide her down the hall. Charles waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. We may not get a better opening than this next session. Daniel looked down at the phone. You think we use it now? I think Laura overcommitted, Charles said. She put herself on the stand and wrapped the whole case in moral injury. That gives us room. Daniel glanced back toward the courtroom doors. What about admissibility? Charles exhaled. We're not in criminal court. This is a divorce proceeding, and judges have latitude. The bigger issue is foundation and credibility. I can't just wave around a recording and hope for fireworks. Daniel almost smiled despite himself. No fireworks? Controlled demolition, Charles said. That's the goal. They moved to a quieter alcove near a tall window overlooking the street. Below them, traffic streamed past the courthouse steps, while camera crews adjusted equipment in the cold. Charles lowered his voice. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to cross-examine Laura hard. Not about everything. About timing, access, and motive. I want her comfortable enough to keep lying. Then I'll move toward Ryan. Daniel's expression hardened. My brother won't crack. Maybe not. But he doesn't know what we have. Men like Ryan get careless when they think they're the smartest person in the room. Daniel looked at the phone again. And if the judge refuses the recording, then we use it to pressure the witness, or to impeach if they deny specific statements. It's still leverage. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said, I want the court to know Annie found this. Charles turned sharply. Do you? Daniel met his gaze. She deserves that much. Charles nodded slowly, but his face stayed cautious. And then what? Laura's attorney will say she's been coached, that she misunderstood, that you involved a child in your defense strategy. I didn't. I know you didn't, Charles said. But truth and argument are not always the same thing in a courtroom. You know that. Daniel looked away. That was the cruel arithmetic of the day. Annie had done the bravest thing of anyone involved, and the legal system might still try to turn her courage into a tactical liability. The side door to the courtroom opened, and Valerie Haynes stepped into the corridor, conferring quietly with Ryan. She didn't notice Daniel and Charles at first. Ryan did. His eyes flicked toward them. Then, seeing the phone in Daniel's hand, he frowned, only slightly, barely visible. But enough. Daniel straightened. Ryan said something to Valerie, then walked toward them with an ease Daniel recognized from childhood. Ryan had always approached conflict like a man entering a party he expected to enjoy. Daniel, he said lightly. Quite a morning. Daniel's voice was flat. You should leave while you still can. Ryan gave a short laugh, still dramatic. Charles stepped half a pace forward. Mr. Whitmore, this is not the time. Ryan ignored him. His eyes stayed on Daniel. You know, if you'd handled the divorce privately, none of this would have happened. Daniel felt the anger move through him, cold and precise. You slept with my wife. Ryan's face didn't change. Your marriage was dead before I got there. Charles said, that's enough. But Daniel wasn't looking at Charles. He was looking at his brother and thinking of all the years behind them. Their mother's funeral, The first loan Daniel had given Ryan. The Christmases, the birthdays, the excuses, the second chances mistaken for love. Ryan's gaze dropped briefly to the phone in Daniel's hand. Something unreadable flickered there. Then he smiled again, too casually. "Whatever you think you have," he said. "Be careful. Court doesn't work the way you want it to." Daniel stepped closer. "No," he said quietly. "But truth does." For the first time, Ryan's expression shifted, only a little, only enough for Daniel to know the hit had landed. Valerie appeared at Ryan's side and touched his arm. "The judge is returning." Ryan held Daniel's gaze for one more second, then walked back toward the courtroom. Charles watched him go. He noticed the phone. "Good," Daniel said. Charles turned to him. "You're angry." Daniel let out a breath through his nose. "That obvious?" "Yes." "Good." Charles's voice stayed measured. "Use that carefully. Anger in a courtroom is expensive." Daniel nodded once. The bailiff called everyone back inside. As they returned to the courtroom, Daniel saw Annie just inside the rear doors with Eleanor. She wasn't supposed to be there yet, but somehow she had made her way closer. She stood very still, her face solemn, her eyes on him. He held up the phone slightly. "A signal. I have it." Annie gave the smallest nod. Then Judge Holloway took the bench again, and the room settled into expectation. Charles opened his file, slid a blank page to the top of his pad, and leaned toward Daniel. "This next part matters," he murmured. Daniel looked across the aisle at Laura and Ryan taking their seats. "I know." What neither Laura nor Ryan seemed to understand yet was that their case no longer belonged to the story they had prepared, because now the truth was no longer hidden in a hallway. It was in the courtroom with them. Judge Holloway adjusted the papers in front of her and looked over the courtroom with the steady patience of someone who had seen too many people mistake confidence for innocence. "Counsel," she said, "you may proceed." Charles Bennett rose slowly. Daniel remained seated, but every muscle in his body tightened. Across the aisle, Laura Whitmore folded her hands neatly on the table. Ryan sat beside her with one ankle resting over the opposite knee, trying to project ease. Valerie Haynes leaned toward Laura and whispered something brief, probably a reminder to stay calm, stay injured, stay believable. Charles buttoned his jacket and stepped into the center of the room. "Your Honor," he said, "before I continue with cross-examination, the defense requests permission to recall Mrs. Whitmore to the stand." Valerie stood immediately. "On what basis?" Charles turned, composed as ever. "On the basis that I have additional questions directly bearing on the credibility of her testimony." Valerie's lips tightened, but Judge Holloway merely nodded. "Mrs. Whitmore, return to the stand." Laura rose with graceful reluctance and moved back to the witness chair. She sat with excellent posture, lifted one hand to smooth a strand of hair behind her ear, and arranged her face into quiet endurance. Charles approached slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began. "You testified this morning that you discovered your husband's alleged affair and then filed for divorce because of his betrayal. Is that correct?" "Yes." "You also testified that you were blindsided by his behavior." "Yes." "And you had no romantic involvement with any other person during the marriage?" Laura did not hesitate. "That's correct." Daniel watched her closely. The lie came easily. Too easily. Charles nodded as though satisfied. "Let's talk about timing. Your husband filed for divorce first, correct?" Laura's gaze flickered once toward Valerie, then back to Charles. "Yes. And only after he filed did you accuse him of infidelity." "I accused him when I had reason to believe it was true." "Of course." Charles took another step. "Now, did you at any point discuss the financial consequences of those accusations with Mr. Ryan Whitmore?" "No." "Never?" "No." Charles glanced toward the defense table, then back at Laura. "Did you ever say, in substance or otherwise, that if the court believed Daniel had cheated, the divorce settlement would crush him?" Valerie shot to her feet. "Objection." Judge Holloway looked down. "Basis. Counsel is testifying and mischaracterizing facts not in evidence." Charles stood still. "I'm asking the witness whether she made the statement." Judge Holloway considered that for only a moment. "Overruled." "Answer the question." Laura kept her face composed, but Daniel saw at that tiny pause, barely perceptible, a hitch in the machinery. "No," she said. "I never said that." Charles nodded once. "Very well." He turned toward the bench. "Your Honor, At this time, the defense requests permission to introduce rebuttal evidence. Valerie's expression sharpened instantly. On what grounds? Charles reached into his inside pocket and removed the phone. The room changed. It happened so subtly that only someone sitting in the middle of it could feel it. A shift of air. A quickening of attention. A stillness with an edge. Ryan straightened in his chair. Laura's face did not move, but the color in it seemed to drain by half a shade. Daniel felt his heart begin to pound, not with panic now, but with something harder. Recognition. This was the moment. Charles held up the old phone. This device contains a recording made inside the Whitmore residence 2 nights ago. The recording captures a conversation between Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Ryan Whitmore discussing the fabrication of the affair allegations currently before this court. The gallery erupted into whispers. Judge Holloway struck her gavel once. Order. Valerie was already standing. Your Honor, I object in the strongest possible terms. We have no foundation, no chain of custody, and no authentication of any kind. This is outrageous. Charles remained calm. The defense is prepared to lay foundation. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. Can you authenticate the voices? Daniel stood. Yes, Your Honor. Valerie turned. Convenient. Judge Holloway ignored her. And the source of the recording? Charles paused. The question hung for a beat longer than Daniel wanted. Then Charles answered carefully. It was obtained by a member of the household who overheard the conversation. Valerie crossed her arms. A child, I assume. Charles said nothing. That was answer enough. Judge Holloway's eyes moved from Charles to Daniel, then to Laura, then briefly to Ryan, who had gone very still. Play it, she said. Valerie objected again, but the judge lifted one hand. I said play it. Charles pressed the button. For one terrible, beautiful second, there was only static. Then Laura's voice came through the speaker. If the judge believes Daniel cheated, the divorce settlement will crush him. The silence that followed those words was unlike any silence Daniel had ever heard. It was not quiet. It was impact. Then Ryan's voice followed. Relax. The fake girlfriend story is airtight. Laura's eyes closed for half a second. Just half. But Daniel saw it. The recording continued. I still can't believe that actress agreed to testify. She was expensive, Ryan said, but worth it. No one in the room moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Once the court believes Daniel had an affair, Ryan went on, his reputation collapses. Investors panic. The board turns against him. And I get half the company, Laura said, and I finally get control of the rest. Charles stopped the recording. The courtroom exploded. Judge Holloway struck the gavel twice, hard enough that the crack echoed against the paneled walls. Order. Now. Valerie was white with fury. Your Honor, this recording must be excluded. It is prejudicial, improperly obtained, and— Sit down, Miss Haynes, Judge Holloway said sharply. Valerie froze. The judge turned to Laura. Mrs. Whitmore, did you deny under oath making the statement heard on that recording? Laura's lips parted, but no sound came immediately. Valerie stepped closer to the witness stand. Do not answer that without no. Ms. Haynes, Judge Holloway said, each word colder than the last. Sit down. Valerie sat. Laura looked at Ryan. That was her second mistake. The first had been making the recording. The second was letting the court see exactly where she turned when she was frightened. Judge Holloway noticed it too. Her attention shifted to Ryan. Mr. Whitmore, she said, you will remain seated. Ryan had been halfway to standing. He lowered himself again, slower this time. Charles spoke with renewed precision. Mrs. Whitmore, were you engaged in a relationship with your husband's brother during your marriage? Laura swallowed. No. Charles reached toward the defense table. Your Honor. The defense also moves to introduce photographs taken inside the marital residence on the same date. He handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to the bench. Judge Holloway studied each one in silence. Then she looked at Laura, then at Ryan, then back at the photographs. The courtroom seemed to lean forward as one body. Valerie rose once more. These images prove nothing more than proximity. Charles's voice remained steady. Combined with the recording, they prove conspiracy, motive, and perjury. Daniel looked across the room at his brother. Ryan no longer looked amused. He looked furious and afraid. For the first time all day, Daniel felt the balance of power shift with unmistakable force. This was no longer Laura's story, no longer Ryan's strategy, no longer a carefully staged tale of a betrayed wife and an unfaithful husband. Now it was what it had always been beneath the surface, a fraud. At the back of the courtroom, Daniel caught sight of Annie standing just inside the doorway beside Eleanor. She was very still, very small, her face solemn, her hands folded, watching the adults finally hear what she had heard first. And Daniel understood, with a rush of emotion so sharp it nearly hurt, that nothing about this day would have turned without her. Judge Holloway set the photographs down. This court will take a brief recess before determining the next evidentiary step and whether referral for further proceedings is warranted. She looked directly at Laura. Mrs. Whitmore, do not leave this building. Then at Ryan. Mr. Whitmore, that instruction applies to you as well. The gavel came down. Everyone began talking at once, but Daniel no longer heard the noise clearly. He was looking only at Annie, and when she met his gaze from across the courtroom, she gave him the smallest nod, as if to say, I told you. The sound after the gavel was almost louder than the sound before it. Voices burst loose all at once, sharp and layered, ricocheting off the paneled walls of courtroom 4. Reporters leaned toward one another. Spectators turned in their seats. Valerie Haynes was already speaking in a fast, furious whisper to Laura, while Ryan Whitmore sat rigid beside them, his jaw so tight it seemed carved from stone. Daniel did not move immediately. He remained seated at the defense table, one hand flat against the wood, his pulse still pounding from the recording that had just shifted the ground beneath everyone in the room. Across the courtroom, Annie stood near the back beside Eleanor Brooks, small and solemn in the middle of adult chaos. Her face held none of the excitement the reporters seemed to feel. No childish thrill, no prideful grin, only a quiet certainty, as if all she had done was place the truth where it belonged. Daniel looked at her and felt something tighten painfully in his chest. He had spent the entire morning trying to shield her from the machinery of this day, and yet she had done what no one else had managed to do. She had cut through the lie. Charles Bennett leaned toward him. Don't say anything yet, he murmured. Not to them, not to the press, not even to Ryan if he comes near you. Daniel kept his eyes on Annie. I'm not sure I trust myself to speak calmly to my brother. That makes 2 of us, Charles said. Judge Holloway had disappeared into chambers through the side door, taking the photographs and the old phone with her. The court clerk remained at her station, organizing papers with the expression of someone who knew the afternoon was about to become much longer than expected. Valerie rose first from the plaintiff's table. Laura, she said sharply under her breath, what exactly have you done? Laura's face had gone pale, but her voice was still controlled. I didn't know she recorded us. Ryan turned toward her. That's what you're worried about? He snapped. You didn't know? Valerie shot him a furious look. Lower your voice. Ryan ignored her. You said the kid was asleep. Laura's composure cracked for the first time. I thought she was. Thought? Ryan hissed. That's your defense? Daniel stood then. The movement drew Annie's eyes at once. He walked toward the back of the courtroom, away from the tables, away from the storm still building at the front. Eleanor met him halfway, resting one hand lightly on Annie's shoulder. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Daniel knelt in front of Annie. She looked at him seriously. Did I do it wrong? She asked. The question hit him harder than anything Laura or Ryan had said all day. Daniel shook his head at once. No, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. No, sweetheart, you did nothing wrong. Annie searched his face. Then why does everyone look mad? Eleanor answered softly before Daniel could. Because sometimes the truth makes guilty people angry. Annie considered that, then nodded once as if it matched what she already suspected. Daniel took both her hands in his. You should have told me sooner, he said gently. I did tell you, Annie replied. He almost laughed. No, I mean before yesterday. She lowered her eyes for a moment. I wanted to be sure. Daniel looked at her, stunned again by the simplicity of it. Sure. At 6 years old, Annie had shown more patience and caution than most adults in the building. He brushed a curl away from her forehead. You were brave. Annie's mouth tightened slightly. I was scared. Daniel felt his throat tighten. That's what brave means. Behind them, the courtroom doors opened, and 2 men in dark suits entered. Not court officers this time. They carried themselves differently, more official, less ceremonial. One spoke quietly with the clerk. The other glanced toward Laura and Ryan. Charles joined Daniel near the rear benches. Court investigators, he said under his breath. That happened faster than I expected. Daniel rose slowly, At least the judge is taking it seriously. Charles gave him a sidelong look. She just heard a recording of perjury and conspiracy in the middle of a contested divorce. Serious is the minimum. At the plaintiff's table, Laura had begun to unravel in more visible ways. She no longer looked like the polished, injured wife from that morning. Her eyes were too bright, her breathing too shallow. Valerie stood close beside her, speaking with tightly controlled intensity. Ryan, on the other hand, had gone in the opposite direction. He had become quiet. That worried Daniel more. Ryan was at his most dangerous when he stopped performing. One of the investigators approached Valerie first, asked a brief question, and was met with visible legal resistance. Then he moved to Ryan. Ryan stood. For one suspended moment, the brothers looked at each other across the room. Years of history passed in that silence. Their mother's funeral in Westchester. The first cheap apartment Ryan had nearly lost until Daniel covered the rent. Business advice ignored. Second chances wasted. Holiday dinners where Ryan joked too loudly and borrowed too often. Every old excuse suddenly stripped down to its core. Ryan had always believed Daniel's steadiness was weakness, that family loyalty could be stretched forever. Now that belief was cracking in public. The investigator said something low to him. Ryan's face hardened. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, Ryan walked toward him. Charles stepped immediately between them. "Not now," he said. Ryan barely looked at him. "This is your fault," he said to Daniel. Daniel's expression did not change. "My fault." "Yes," Ryan said. "You always had to win." Daniel stared at him. "You slept with my wife." Ryan's jaw flexed. "You were never really a husband to her." It was such an old lie, such a cowardly refuge, that Daniel almost felt tired instead of angry. "Whatever helps you sleep," he said quietly. Ryan laughed once, bitter and humorless. "You think this is over because of one recording?" Charles answered this time. "No. It's over because you were stupid enough to tell the truth out loud." Ryan's eyes flashed. For a second, Daniel thought he might actually swing at him, right there in the courtroom, in front of everyone. But the investigator stepped forward at once. "Mr. Whitmore, I need you to remain available." Ryan looked from Daniel to Annie. That was the moment Daniel changed. Not visibly, not in any way the courtroom would record, but something inside him hardened permanently when his brother's gaze landed on the child. Daniel stepped closer, voice low and lethal. "You don't look at her again." Ryan smirked, but it was weaker now. "She's the one who made this messy." "No," Daniel said. "You did." Eleanor drew Annie slightly behind her, protective and unmistakably firm. Ryan seemed about to respond, but Valerie reached him first and pulled him back toward the plaintiff's table. "Enough," she snapped. "Every word out of your mouth makes this worse." Charles let out a slow breath. "Well," he said, "at least one person over there still has a functioning brain." Daniel didn't answer. He was watching Laura now. For the first time all day, she looked directly at Annie. Not with affection, not even with anger. With something more complicated. Fear, perhaps, or shame, if she still had enough left for it. Annie noticed the look and pressed a little closer to Eleanor. Daniel knelt again beside her. "Do you want to wait outside for a while?" She shook her head. "I want to stay." "Why?" Her answer came without hesitation. "In case they lie again." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Then he smiled despite everything. "That seems to be a theme with you." Annie almost smiled back. Before either of them could say more, the bailiff called for everyone to return to their places. Judge Holloway re-entered from chambers, carrying the photographs herself. The old phone was in a clear evidence pouch now. That detail made the whole thing feel suddenly larger than a divorce, larger than Laura, larger than Ryan. The judge took her seat and surveyed the room with a face that had lost whatever patience remained from the morning session. "Be seated," she said. The room obeyed instantly. Daniel guided Annie and Eleanor to the rear bench, then returned to the defense table beside Charles. Judge Holloway opened a fresh page in the file. "This court has reviewed the rebuttal evidence," she said. "Given the seriousness of what has been presented, I am prepared to hear limited additional testimony on authenticity, chain of possession, and any explanation the plaintiff wishes to offer before I determine next steps." She looked directly at Laura. "Mrs. Whitmore, I suggest that if there is anything about this matter I need to hear from you, now would be the time." The silence that followed felt alive. Laura slowly rose, and for the first time since the proceedings began, Daniel had no idea what she was about to do. Laura Whitmore rose so slowly it seemed, for a moment, that she might decide against it. The courtroom held its breath. At the defense table, Daniel sat motionless beside Charles Bennett, his eyes fixed on the woman he had once believed he would grow old with. Just hours earlier, Laura had looked composed, controlled, almost untouchable. Now something in her posture had changed. The elegant line of her shoulders had gone rigid. One hand rested against the edge of the table as though she needed it for balance. Judge Holloway watched her without expression. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said, "you may explain the statements heard on that recording." Laura swallowed once. Then she lifted her chin. "The recording lacks context." Valerie Haynes closed her eyes for half a second, the look of a woman who knew she had been handed the weakest possible answer and was being forced to work with it. Judge Holloway did not blink. "What context?" she asked. "Would justify a discussion of a fake girlfriend and a paid witness?" Laura's fingers tightened on the table edge. Daniel could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. He knew that look. Laura was deciding, in real time, which version of the truth might still save her. She chose badly. "I was angry," she said. "I said things I didn't mean." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway lifted one hand, and the room fell quiet again. "You did not mean them," the judge repeated. Yet the witness this morning testified to the very scenario described in the recording. Laura opened her mouth, then closed it. Valerie rose. "Your Honor, if I may." "No," the judge said sharply. "Your client is speaking." Laura glanced at Valerie, then toward Ryan. That glance said everything. At the plaintiff's table, Ryan sat very still, but Daniel saw the fury gathering in him like pressure behind glass. He had always hated losing control of a situation. Even as a boy, he would smile right up until the moment things stopped going his way. Then the temper came. Daniel remembered him at 16, smashing a window in their father's garage because someone else had been given the car keys. Their father had called it youthful frustration. Their mother, if she had still been alive then, might have called it what it was: entitlement. Judge Holloway looked from Laura to Ryan and back again. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "did you or did you not arrange for a woman to falsely testify that she had been involved with your husband?" The question landed with a clean brutality. There was no room left in it for elegance. Laura's composure faltered. Her voice, when it came, was thinner. "I never arranged anything personally." Charles stood immediately. "Your Honor, I move to strike that as non-responsive." "Granted," Judge Holloway said. "Answer the question." Laura turned toward Valerie again, but Valerie did not rescue her this time. Perhaps she knew there was no rescue left to offer. "Finally," Laura said. Ryan handled most of it. The entire room shifted toward Ryan like iron filings toward a magnet. Ryan pushed back his chair and stood. "That's not what happened." Judge Holloway's face hardened. "Mr. Whitmore, sit down unless you are called." Ryan remained standing for one dangerous second too long. Then he sat, but the damage was done. Charles rose, buttoned his jacket, and approached the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, "in light of that statement, the defense requests permission to call Mr. Ryan Whitmore." Valerie stood at once. "Absolutely not. My client is not on trial here." Judge Holloway gave her a look that could have frosted glass. "That remains to be seen." Ryan's face darkened. Daniel watched him carefully. He had seen that expression before too. Not just anger. Not just fear. Resentment. The resentment of a man who believed the world had long denied him what he deserved. The bailiff swore Ryan in. He took the stand with stiff reluctance, his eyes refusing to go near Daniel. He looked instead at the judge, then at Valerie, then out toward the gallery as if he might still find a friendly face somewhere in the room. There wasn't one. Charles took his time reaching the witness stand. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, "did you tell your sister-in-law that the fake girlfriend story was airtight?" Ryan did not hesitate. "No." Charles lifted the evidence pouch containing the phone. "The court has heard the recording. That recording was edited." Valerie closed her eyes again. Charles's voice remained pleasantly neutral. "Do you have evidence of that?" Ryan said nothing. "Did you pay Miss Natalie Mercer, to testify falsely?" "No." Charles walked to the defense table, picked up a folder, and returned. "In discovery, your financial records show a wire transfer to an entity called Mercer Consulting 3 days before this action was filed." "Coincidence?" Ryan's face changed. "Just slightly, but it was enough." Charles held the page up for the court. The amount transferred was $25,000. Valerie shot to her feet. Objection. We have not had the opportunity to review that document. Charles did not even look at her. You had every opportunity. It came from your client's supplemental production last night. Judge Holloway turned to Valerie. Sit down. Valerie sat. Charles placed the document on the witness stand rail. Mr. Whitmore? Ryan's throat moved as he swallowed. It was a business payment. To whom? A consultant. What kind of consultant? Ryan's silence stretched just long enough to become its own answer. Charles took one measured step closer. Mr. Whitmore, is it your testimony that the money was unrelated to Natalie Mercer? Yes. Charles nodded as if he were satisfied. Then he reached for another paper. And would you also like to explain why Miss Mercer's Manhattan lease application lists you as an emergency contact? For the first time all day, Ryan lost the room. It happened in a single flicker, a tightening around the mouth, a brief, stunned stare at Charles, the realization that the path ahead had vanished. The gallery reacted at once, a rustle of movement and breath and whispered speculation. Judge Holloway struck the gavel. Order. Ryan leaned back in the witness chair. But the movement looked less like confidence now and more like retreat. Daniel sat perfectly still, though inside him every nerve felt alive. Charles had him, not emotionally, not morally. Factually, that was always harder to escape. At the rear bench, Daniel could see Annie beside Eleanor, watching with wide, solemn eyes. Annie did not understand wire transfers, or discovery production, or the rules of impeachment, but she understood what was happening. The bad people were no longer speaking with easy smiles. Truth had changed their faces. Charles continued, Mr. Whitmore, did you engage in an affair with your brother's wife? Valerie rose again. Objection. Judge Holloway overruled her before she had finished the word. Ryan's voice came out lower now. That is irrelevant. Charles tilted his head. It speaks directly to motive. Ryan looked toward Laura. Laura looked down. And in that instant, Daniel knew they were both finished. Not because of the affair itself, not because of the public humiliation, but because the alliance between them had cracked. Conspiracies hold only as long as every conspirator believes silence is safer than blame. Now both of them were calculating survival. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Answer the question, Mr. Whitmore. Ryan's jaw worked once. Then he said, yes. The courtroom seemed to draw in a single stunned breath. Daniel did not move. He had known. He had heard the recording. He had seen the photographs. And still, hearing the words spoken aloud under oath felt like being struck somewhere old and deep. Yes, one syllable, enough to collapse years of denial. At the back, Annie shifted slightly and looked up at Eleanor, who placed a gentle hand over the child's. Judge Holloway looked from Ryan to Laura. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, do you dispute that testimony? Laura closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something in her had gone flat. No. It was almost a whisper, but the courtroom heard it. Daniel looked down at his hands. For a strange second, he thought of the first Christmas after he and Laura were married. Snow outside the windows, music low in the living room, Ryan laughing over bourbon by the fireplace, Annie not yet in his life, the house still echoing with plans for a future that had seemed possible then. How little any of us know, he thought, about the people sitting at our own table. Judge Holloway closed the file in front of her with deliberate care. This court will recess for 30 minutes. Upon return, I will address sanctions, referral for further investigation, and the immediate implications for the pending divorce and custody matters. She looked directly at Laura and Ryan. Neither of you is to leave this building. The gavel came down. The room erupted again, louder than before. But Daniel remained seated, hearing only one thing beneath the noise. The silence after Ryan said yes. The silence where denial used to be. When the courtroom emptied again, it did not feel like a recess. It felt like the aftermath of a collapse. Reporters spilled into the hallway in a rush of sharpened voices and half-finished headlines. Court officers moved faster now, no longer performing routine order but containing fallout. Every conversation in the corridor seemed to lower itself when Daniel Whitmore passed, then rise again the moment he moved on. He barely noticed. He walked straight to the rear bench where Annie and Eleanor were waiting. Annie stood before he reached her. Her eyes searched his face with the same solemn intensity she had carried all day, as if she needed to know whether the adults were finally seeing what she had seen first. Daniel stopped in front of her and, for a moment, could not speak. He had prepared himself for the humiliation of being lied about in public. He had prepared himself for the business consequences, the photographs, the whispering, the ugly appetite strangers had for scandal. He had even prepared himself for Laura's performance. He had not prepared himself for the sound of his brother admitting the affair under oath. Yes, such a small word, such a violent one. Annie reached for his hand first. "Did the judge hear everything?" she asked. Daniel looked down at her small fingers curling around his. "Yes," he said quietly. "She heard." Annie nodded once, as though confirming an expected result. "Good." The simplicity of it nearly broke him. Eleanor placed one hand lightly on Daniel's arm. "Sit down before you fall down," she said softly. That almost made him laugh. He sat beside Annie on the bench, elbows on his knees for a moment, trying to slow the pounding in his chest. Eleanor remained standing, protective by instinct, her gaze moving across the corridor like a sentry who had no intention of letting disaster near the child again. Charles Bennett joined them a minute later, carrying 2 folders and wearing the expression of a man whose mind was already 3 moves ahead. "We have momentum," he said quietly. "But we're not done." Daniel looked up. "I know." Charles glanced toward Annie, then lowered his voice further. "The judge is furious. That helps. But fury isn't the same thing as a final ruling. We still need to get through the next session cleanly." Daniel nodded. "What's Laura's side going to do?" Charles exhaled. "Damage control. Valerie will try to isolate Ryan, argue that Laura was emotionally vulnerable, manipulated, frightened, something along those lines. If she can make Laura look weak instead of malicious, she'll try." Eleanor let out a sound that was almost a snort. "Weak. That woman." Charles allowed himself the smallest smile. "I didn't say it was good lawyering. I said she'd try." Annie listened to all this with grave attention. Then she asked, "Are they still going to say Dad is bad?" Charles crouched, so he was closer to her level. "They may try," he said, "but they're not in a very strong position anymore." Annie frowned slightly. "Because they got caught." "Yes," Charles said, "because they got caught." At the far end of the corridor, a cluster of reporters surged suddenly toward a side door as Laura emerged with Valerie. Flashbulbs popped, microphones lifted. Questions struck the air from all directions. "Mrs. Whitmore, did you fabricate testimony? Did you conspire with your brother-in-law? Did your daughter discover the evidence?" Laura flinched at that last question. Daniel saw it from across the hall. For the first time all day, she looked less like a strategist and more like someone cornered by consequences she had not imagined would ever fully arrive. Valerie pulled her forward without stopping, her face set in legal fury. Ryan followed several steps behind, escorted by one of the investigators, and his expression had changed completely now. No charm, no smoothness, only cold hatred directed at whoever had pulled the curtain back. When his eyes found Daniel, they held there. Then they shifted to Annie. Daniel rose at once. The movement was immediate enough that Charles stepped in front of him instinctively. But Daniel did not advance. He simply stood between Ryan and the bench where Annie sat. Ryan saw that, and for a long second, neither brother looked away. Daniel thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that some relationships do not end in arguments. They end in recognition. In finally seeing what has always been there. Ryan's mouth moved into the faintest mockery of a smile. Then the investigator directed him toward the opposite hallway and he disappeared from view. Only after he was gone did Daniel sit again. Eleanor said quietly, "You did right." Daniel stared at the floor. "I should have seen him years ago." "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but that's not the same as causing this." He knew she was right. It did not make the thought disappear. Annie leaned lightly against his arm. "Dad? Yes? Are you mad at me for recording them?" Daniel turned so quickly that she blinked. "Mad at you?" She nodded. "You looked sad." For a second he could not answer. Then he took her hand again. "I'm sad because people I trusted did ugly things," he said gently. "I'm not sad because of you." Annie seemed to think this over very carefully. Then she said, "I didn't want them to win." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "They didn't," he said. "Not anymore." A court officer appeared and informed counsel that proceedings would resume in 10 minutes. Charles stood, adjusted his tie, and looked down at Daniel. I need to speak with the clerk and make sure the chain of custody issue is fully covered when we go back in. Daniel nodded. Charles hesitated, then looked at Annie. You did something very important today. Annie's face remained serious. Because they lied. Yes, Charles said. Because they lied. After he left, the corridor grew quieter around them. Some of the spectators had wandered off in search of other drama. Others remained, pretending not to stare at the child everyone now seemed to understand was at the center of the day. Daniel noticed the attention and instinctively moved closer to Annie. Eleanor noticed too. People always like courage more when they're safely watching it from a distance, she murmured. Daniel gave her a tired look. You always have a sentence for everything. Comes with age, she said. That, somehow, loosened something in him. Not enough for laughter, but enough for breath. The second session began with less theater and more gravity. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. The earlier appetite for scandal had been replaced by the sharper focus that follows real damage. Even the reporters seemed to understand that this was no longer merely a society divorce with a salacious twist. It was possible perjury, fraud, conspiracy. Judge Holloway entered with a file thicker than before and the old phone still sealed in the evidence pouch. Be seated, she said. Everyone obeyed at once. Daniel sat at the defense table with Charles beside him. Laura and Ryan sat across the aisle, but the resemblance to the morning session ended there. Laura looked worn now, as though the effort of maintaining a false version of herself had drained the color from her skin. Ryan looked furious and dangerous in the particular way of men forced to sit still while consequences gather around them. Judge Holloway folded her hands. This court has heard sworn testimony that directly contradicts evidence introduced during these proceedings. I will now address the status of the matter before me. Valerie rose immediately. Your Honor, before the court takes any action, the plaintiff requests an opportunity to amend. No, Judge Holloway said. The single word landed like a door shutting. Valerie tried again. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore has been under extreme emotional strain and Judge Holloway leaned forward. Miss Haynes, your client presented fabricated testimony, concealed a conspiracy relevant to the division of marital assets, and appears to have used this court as a stage for a fraudulent claim. Do not insult me with the phrase emotional strain. The courtroom went perfectly still. Daniel did not move, neither did Laura. Judge Holloway continued. With respect to the divorce action, I am striking the infidelity allegations against Mr. Whitmore from the record pending formal review of sanctions. With respect to the property issues, I am referring the financial and testimonial irregularities to the appropriate authorities. She turned toward Ryan, and with respect to Mr. Riffin's, Ryan Whitmore, I am ordering the transcript and evidence forwarded for investigation into perjury, witness tampering, and any related misconduct. Ryan's chair scraped the floor as he rose half an inch before sitting back down again. Valerie put a restraining hand on his sleeve. Judge Holloway then looked to the rear bench where Annie sat beside Eleanor. Her voice changed slightly, not softer, but human. And before this court adjourns, there is one more matter. Daniel followed her gaze. He knew, before the judge spoke the child's name, that whatever came next would stay with Annie the rest of her life. Judge Holloway's gaze remained fixed on the rear bench. And before this court adjourns, she said, there is one more matter. The entire room seemed to follow the direction of her eyes. Annie sat very still beside Eleanor Brooks, her small hands folded in her lap, her face solemn and unreadable in the way children's faces sometimes became when too many adults were looking at them at once. Daniel felt his heartbeat slow and sharpen. He knew that feeling. It was not fear exactly. It was the sensation of standing on the edge of a moment that would matter long after the words themselves were gone. Judge Holloway looked at the bailiff. Would you bring Annie Whitmore forward, please? A murmur passed through the courtroom. Valerie Haynes closed her eyes briefly, as if one more indignity had just been added to a day already beyond saving. Laura stiffened in her chair. Ryan went cold and expressionless, the look of a man trying to disappear without physically moving. At the defense table, Daniel turned halfway in his seat. Annie looked up at Eleanor first. Eleanor gave a small nod. Then Annie stood. Daniel was on his feet before he realized he had moved. Judge Holloway noticed. Mr. Whitmore, she said, you may accompany her. Thank you, Your Honor. Daniel crossed the room to meet Annie near the aisle. She slipped her hand into his without hesitation, and together they walked toward the bench. The image would be in tomorrow's papers, he knew. The billionaire and the child. But that was no longer what mattered. What mattered was the weight of her small fingers in his hand. What mattered was the fact that she had walked into a day built by liars and somehow left it more honest than she found it. When they reached the front, Annie stood beside him and looked up at the judge. Judge Holloway removed her glasses. It was a simple gesture, but it changed the whole atmosphere of the room. Less distance, less bench, more person. "Annie," she said, "do you understand where you are?" "Yes, ma'am." "And do you understand that today, because of what you brought forward, this court heard evidence that might otherwise have remained hidden?" Annie glanced at Daniel for one quick second, then back at the judge. "Yes, ma'am." Judge Holloway studied her carefully. "Why did you record that conversation?" The courtroom went so still that Daniel could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Annie answered without drama, "Because they were lying about my dad." The judge nodded once. "And why did that matter to you?" Annie's voice stayed small, but clear. "Because he's good." Something moved through the room then. Not noise, not speech. Something quieter and more dangerous to hardened people. "Feeling?" Judge Holloway asked. "Did anyone tell you to make that recording?" "No, ma'am." "Did your father ask you to help him in this case?" Annie shook her head at once. "No." Judge Holloway looked at Daniel, then back at Annie. "So this was your idea?" "Yes, ma'am." The judge's expression softened, though only slightly. "Do you know what courage is?" Annie thought about it. "A little." A faint smile touched the corners of Judge Holloway's mouth. "Would you like me to tell you what I think it is?" Annie nodded. "Courage," Judge Holloway said, "is telling the truth when the truth is the hardest thing in the room." For the first time all day, Annie smiled. It was a small smile, almost private. Daniel felt it like sunlight breaking through a storm he had forgotten could end. Judge Holloway leaned back. "You may return to your seat in a moment," she said. "But before you do, I want the record to reflect that this child's actions were not manipulative, theatrical, or improper in spirit. They were the actions of a child who saw dishonesty and tried, in the only way she knew how, to protect a parent she loves." She paused. Many adults in this room could learn from that. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Laura's face had gone still in a different way now. Not controlled. Emptied. Daniel looked at her and saw, perhaps for the first time, the full cost of what she had done. Not the legal cost, not the financial one, the moral one. She had not only betrayed a husband, she had betrayed the faith of a child. Judge Holloway replaced her glasses. "As to the practical matters before the court," she said, her tone shifting back into formal authority, "I am entering a temporary order recognizing Mr. Daniel Whitmore as the sole custodial parent pending final disposition. All prior insinuations regarding his alleged infidelity are stricken from consideration at this stage." Valerie rose automatically. "Your Honor, with respect." "No," Judge Holloway said. "With respect is exactly what your side has lacked today." Valerie sat. The judge continued. "Mrs. Whitmore's access to the child will be supervised until this court has further reviewed the extent to which she involved family resources, household access, or personal relationships in the conduct now before me." That hit Laura harder than the public humiliation had. She stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I would never hurt Annie." Judge Holloway looked at her with open disbelief. "You already have." Laura froze. A silence followed that no one in the courtroom seemed willing to interrupt. Daniel felt Annie's fingers tighten around his. He looked down at her. She was not crying. That hurt more somehow. Children should not have to become composed this early. Judge Holloway turned a page. "The matter of financial distribution will proceed on revised terms after referral review. The court will not reward a manufactured scandal. Mr. Whitmore's counsel may submit a motion for fees and sanctions within 10 business days." Charles inclined his head. "Thank you, Your Honor." Ryan spoke then, unable to help himself. "This is absurd." Every head turned. Judge Holloway's face chilled. "Mr. Whitmore, the only reason you are not leaving this courtroom in handcuffs is that procedure takes longer than your arrogance." Even Charles, who valued restraint more than oxygen, had no immediate response to that. Ryan sat back slowly. Daniel could see in his brother's face the exact instant where entitlement became fear. At the rear of the gallery, one of the reporters lowered her notebook just enough to stare openly. This was no longer a glamorous divorce story. This was ruin. Judge Holloway looked once more at Daniel and Annie. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you may take your daughter home." The words landed with a force Daniel had not expected. Home, after weeks of accusations, strategy meetings, leaked photographs, and whispered damage control. The simplest victory in the world was the right to take his child home. His voice came out low. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned slightly toward Annie. "We're done," he whispered. She looked up at him as if making sure she had heard correctly. "Done? For today," he said, and smiled. That finally did it. The 6-year-old's face softened, and the first real relief he had seen in her all day appeared in her eyes. Daniel bent and lifted her into his arms. She wrapped both arms around his neck at once. The courtroom watched in silence. No one with any decency left in them could mistake that embrace for performance. At the plaintiff's table, Laura looked away. Daniel held Annie a moment longer than he needed to. Then he turned and carried her back down the aisle. Eleanor met them halfway. One hand pressed briefly to her mouth before she gathered herself again. Charles followed with his files, his expression still disciplined, though Daniel could see the satisfaction beneath it. As they moved toward the exit, Annie murmured against Daniel's shoulder, soft enough that only he could hear. "Dad? Yes? I told you I'd defend you." Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. "I know," he said. "And you did." Outside the courthouse, Manhattan had already turned the story into weather. The cold hit first, then the flash of cameras, then the voices. "Mr. Whitmore, did your wife fabricate the affair? Is it true your daughter provided the key evidence? Mrs. Whitmore, do you have a statement?" Daniel stepped through the courthouse doors with Annie still in his arms, Eleanor Brooks at his side, and Charles Bennett just half a step behind them. The sky above Center Street was the pale gray of late winter, and the wind came sharp between the buildings, carrying exhaust, traffic noise, and the restless appetite of the city. For one brief second, Daniel considered turning around and walking straight back inside, but Annie's arms were looped around his neck, and her cheek rested against his shoulder with the exhausted trust of a child who had been brave for too many hours in a row. So he kept walking. Charles moved ahead first, one hand raised toward the cluster of reporters. "No statements at this time," he said evenly. "Please give them space." That did not stop the questions. They came faster now, louder, more desperate, as though truth were only valuable if it could be turned into tonight's headline before sunset. Daniel hated that part of the world. He had spent years learning how to live with press coverage, investor scrutiny, and the strange, predatory interest that followed wealth. But this was different. It was no longer only his reputation under public light. It was Annie, and the sight of camera lenses turning toward the child in his arms awakened something old and primal in him, something deeper than anger and cleaner than fear. He stopped at the curb and shifted Annie slightly, shielding her face against his shoulder. "Daniel," Charles murmured. "Car's a minute out." A reporter stepped forward anyway, her voice sharper than the rest. "Mr. Whitmore, can you confirm that your daughter uncovered the scheme?" Daniel turned his head just enough to answer. "My daughter is 6 years old," he said, his voice low but carrying. "She is not part of your story." The woman froze. So did several others. Good, Daniel thought. Let that be the line. Eleanor stood beside him like a second wall, her gloved hand resting lightly against Annie's back. She did not look at the press. She looked only at the street, watching for the car with the unshakable focus of a woman who had already decided what mattered and had no interest in the rest. Annie stirred slightly. "Dad?" "Yes, sweetheart. Are we really going home?" He tightened his hold on her. "Yes." She was quiet for a second. Then she whispered, "Good." The sedan pulled up at last. Charles opened the rear door himself. Daniel slid into the back seat with Annie still in his arms, and Eleanor climbed in beside them. By the time the door shut, cutting off the noise of reporters and traffic, Daniel felt as though someone had sealed them inside a smaller, safer world. The driver pulled away from the curb. For several blocks, no one spoke. The city moved past in familiar fragments. Courthouse steps, corner delis, men in overcoats with takeaway coffee, a bus exhaling at a red light. The ordinary machinery of New York continuing without pause, indifferent to human ruin and relief alike. Annie finally lifted her head from Daniel's shoulder. "Is Mom coming home?" The question entered the car softly, but it changed the air at once. Daniel looked out the window before answering. Children always knew how to find the one question adults wished they could postpone. "No," he said gently. "Not today." "Because of court?" "Yes." Annie leaned back against him again. "She lied." Daniel glanced down at her. "Yes." "Why?" There it was again. That question. Simple. Impossible. The one that had threaded through the whole day and would not leave because it had no clean answer. Daniel chose honesty over comfort. "Because sometimes people want something so badly," he said. "They start telling themselves that the truth is the problem." Annie thought about that. Then she asked, "Did Uncle Ryan do that too?" Daniel looked at his hands. "Yes." Eleanor's voice came quietly from beside them. "That's what greed does, baby. It makes people believe they're owed what was never theirs." Annie nodded slowly, absorbing it with that grave concentration that always made her seem older than 6. When they reached the townhouse on the Upper East Side, the late afternoon light had already begun to fade. The familiar stone steps, black iron railings, and brass-trimmed door had never looked more comforting to Daniel. Home, the word meant something different now than it had that morning. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish, old wood, and the beef stew Eleanor had left simmering before they left for court. The quiet here felt warm instead of tense, earned instead of empty. Daniel set Annie down in the foyer. She looked around as if confirming that the walls were still theirs, that the rugs were still in place, that safety had not somehow been repossessed while they were gone. Then she looked up at him. "Can I change into pajamas even if it's not nighttime?" Daniel smiled for the first time since leaving the courtroom. "Yes, I think that's an excellent legal strategy." That earned a tiny smile from her. Eleanor touched Annie's shoulder. "Come on, sugar. Let's get you comfortable." As they started toward the staircase, Annie turned back. "Dad?" "Yes? You're coming too, right?" The question was not really about stairs or pajamas. Daniel understood that. "I'll be right behind you." She seemed satisfied with that and disappeared upstairs with Eleanor. The silence that followed was different from the silence in his office the night before. Last night it had been full of dread. Tonight it was full of aftermath. Charles remained in the foyer, briefcase in hand. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Daniel nodded toward the library. 5 minutes later, they sat with 2 untouched glasses of water between them on a low table. Legal folders spread open again. It felt almost obscene, returning to paperwork so soon after the emotional violence of the day. But Daniel knew better than most that consequences did not pause simply because feelings were exhausted. Charles removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Well," he said, "there are still several fires burning, but they're not burning in our house anymore." Daniel exhaled. "What happens next?" Charles leaned back. "Best case? Laura's side retreats, agrees to revised terms, and tries to salvage whatever remains of her public dignity. Worst case? Valerie throws every procedural argument she can think of at the judge's orders, and Ryan starts making desperate decisions." Daniel's expression hardened. "Could he?" Charles gave him a careful look. People who lose power quickly sometimes confuse desperation with strategy. Daniel stared toward the darkened window. Ryan had spent years believing he lived in Daniel's shadow. Today, for the first time, that shadow had become a wall. And Laura, Charles was quiet for a moment. "I think Laura finally realized the difference between manipulation and consequence." Daniel almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. She looked at Annie in court. "I saw." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'll never forgive that." Charles did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its courtroom precision. "You don't have to decide forgiveness today." "No," Daniel thought. "Not today. Maybe not ever." Footsteps came softly from the stairs. Annie appeared in the doorway of the library wearing flannel pajamas covered in little silver stars. Her hair had been brushed back and loosely braided by Eleanor. Without the courthouse, without the tension, without the adults' lies around her, she looked suddenly and unmistakably like what she was, a child. Daniel's heart ached at the sight. Charles stood at once. "I'll let you both rest," he said. Daniel rose too and shook his hand. "You saved me in there." Charles glanced toward Annie. "No," he said quietly. "She did." After he left, Daniel crossed the room and opened his arms. Annie came straight into them. He lifted her easily and carried her into the kitchen, where Eleanor was ladling stew into bowls. The table had been set with thick napkins, warm bread, and the kind of simple order that made pain survivable. No one spoke much during dinner. They didn't need to. Annie ate slowly at first, then with real hunger. Eleanor asked if she wanted extra bread. Annie did. Daniel watched her take another spoonful of stew and felt a kind of gratitude so sharp it was almost indistinguishable from grief. After dinner, he carried her upstairs and tucked her into bed himself. The room glowed softly with lamplight. The stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was a toddler lay against the pillow. Outside the window, Manhattan glittered in the dark like 1,000 promises made by strangers. Annie looked up at him as he pulled the blanket to her chin. "Dad?" "Yes. Did I really help?" Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. He thought of the courtroom falling silent when the recording played. He thought of Ryan saying yes. He thought of Judge Holloway telling him he could take his daughter home. Then he looked at Annie. "You told the truth," he said. "And sometimes that changes everything." She seemed to think that over. Then she asked one final question. "Are we okay now?" Daniel brushed a thumb gently over her forehead. "We're together," he said. "That's how I know we'll be okay." Her eyes drifted closed a few moments later. Daniel stayed beside her longer than usual, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing until the day finally loosened its grip on both of them. When he rose and walked to the window, he could see his reflection in the glass. Tired. Older than yesterday. Changed, but not broken. On the nightstand behind him sat the old phone in a clear evidence sleeve, returned temporarily by the court clerk for counsel review before formal processing in the morning. Such an ordinary thing. Scratched case, fading battery, a child's forgotten device, and yet it had carried the truth when adults would not. Daniel looked back at Annie sleeping under the star-patterned blanket and thought of the words she had spoken in his office, almost as if she had been making a promise to both of them. "I'll defend my dad in court." She had, and as he turned off the lamp and stood for one last second in the doorway, Daniel understood something he would carry for the rest of his life. Family was never about blood. Not really. It was about who stood beside you when the lie was loudest. The house went quiet around him. Downstairs, Eleanor moved gently through the kitchen, putting away dishes. Outside, the city kept roaring toward tomorrow. And upstairs, in a little room at the top of the townhouse, the child he had chosen slept safely under his roof. For the first time in many weeks, Daniel Whitmore believed that tomorrow might belong to the truth. This story reminds us that truth and courage are not measured by age, power, or wealth. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the greatest strength. Annie did not have lawyers, influence, or authority. She only had honesty and love for her father, yet that was enough to expose deception and restore justice. The lesson for all of us is simple but powerful. When people choose truth over fear and loyalty over betrayal, even the most carefully built lies will eventually fall apart. Real family is not defined by blood or appearances, but by those who stand beside you when your reputation, dignity, and future are under attack. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.